Welcome back to World Cup history. My name is Lavender Bai and I am your World Cup historian. Now, we've got plenty more World Cups to come, but before we get into the next one, I want to take a little detour to talk about a family that, despite having never actually played a World Cup, had such a monumental impact on the tournament and the development of football overall. Some would argue their mark on this game is unmatched. Sit down, grab a drink, and let me tell you the story of the Dassler brothers. How one family gave us two of the most iconic sporting brands in history, and how they let it destroy them. Now, the Dassler brothers didn't agree on much in life, and ultimately this would go on to destroy their entire family. But one thing they did agree on is something known as the Pele Pact. A formal, binding agreement that neither Adidas nor Puma would sign Pele, the world's most famous athlete. The brothers were competitive, sure, but they were also smart enough to know that a bidding war to sign the Brazilian would bankrupt both companies. But then the 1970 World Cup changed everything. Mexico City, June 1970, the quarterfinal between Brazil and Peru. The greatest footballer in the world walks into the center circle. He signals to the referee that he needs a moment, and then he kneels down. The cameras all zoom in as millions of people at home are watching the World Cup broadcast in color for the very first time. They watch Pele slowly, deliberately tie his shoelaces. He had been paid $120,000 to do it, equivalent to over $1 million today. Not to score a goal, not to endorse a product in an advertisement, just to kneel down and tie his boots at kickoff so that every camera in the stadium and every television around the world would see the brand on his feet. If you think about it, he's kind of the first ever influencer. That brand was Puma. Puma had broken the pact. Adidas was furious, but Puma didn't care. Their sales had increased 300% after the tournament. So this would have been shady business at the best of times, but you have to remember that the two men that made this agreement were brothers. The two men that founded Adidas and Puma grew up together in the same house. They built a company in their mother's laundry room together. They watched Jesse Owens win 4 gold medals in the shoes that they designed at Hitler's Berlin Olympics. They then went on to build anti-tank weapons for the Third Reich, and ultimately they would testify against each other at denazification hearings. In the end, they would split their company in two, divide their hometown straight down the middle, and never speak to each other again. Ultimately, they would be buried at opposite ends of the same cemetery, as far apart as two graves could possibly be. This is the story of Adi and Rudi Dassler. It's one of the strangest stories in the history of sport, and it'll make you feel a hell of a lot better about your trivial family drama. So this story starts in a small town in Bavaria, about 20 kilometers from Nuremberg, a population of only 3,500 people in the 1920s, and a long tradition of shoemaking. By 1922, this town had over 100 cobblers. In a town that size, that is essentially everyone. Big shoe guys around here. Adolf Dassler, known as Adi, and his older brother Rudolf, known as Rudi, grew up there. Their father Christoph was the last in the line of weavers and dyers before becoming a cobbler himself when the local textile industry declined. The Dasslers were a shoemaking family in a shoemaking town. Lord knows how anything else got done in this town because it seems like everybody was just making shoes. So after returning from World War I, Adi began making shoes in his mother's laundry room. The electricity supply in the town was so unreliable that he and Rudi rigged up a stationary bike to generate enough power to run the equipment. Picture this, 2 brothers in a laundry room, one of them just absolutely racking up kilometers on this bike to power the energy to make the shoes. So Adi was the quiet one. He was thoughtful, creative, and obsessed with the technical side of making shoes. He wanted to know how to make a shoe lighter, faster, and better suited to a specific sport. And then there was Rudi, who was the extrovert. He was the salesman. He was the man that got the athletes to wear the shoes and the man that got the world to notice. Together they were, at least in theory, the perfect partnership. In 1924, they officially formed the Dassler Brothers Sports Shoe Factory. And by 1928, they were outfitting athletes at the Amsterdam Olympics. A couple of years down the track, if we fast forward to 1936, there they were at the Berlin Games. the Nazi Olympics, with the most famous client of their career. I am, of course, talking about Jesse Owens, not Hitler. Okay, so Hitler has staged the most elaborate sports washing event in history. All of the world's cameras are pointed at Germany. The Third Reich is on display, and they have a message to send to the world. But unfortunately, there is a man who is about to embarrass everything Hitler stands for. An African-American sprinter named Jesse Owens, who just so happens to be wearing shoes made by two German brothers from a cobbler family. So Rudi Dassler approaches Owens at the games and gets him to wear their spiked athletic shoes. He goes on to win 4 gold medals. In total, athletes wearing Dassler shoes at the 1936 Olympics won 7 gold medals, 5 silver, and 5 bronze. So obviously there were heaps of athletes that won medals wearing Dassler brothers shoes, but the Jesse Owens one is particularly important considering the fact that this was happening in Nazi Germany, and, well, both of the Dassler brothers were registered Nazis. So both brothers were members of the Nazi Party, but I need to add a caveat that the exact nature of their commitment to the ideology is disputed. At the time, joining the Nazi Party was, for many German businessmen, a practical decision rather than an ideological one. But in saying that, we're also not going to sit here and make excuses for Nazis. But the fact remains, 2 Nazi Party members made the shoes that Jesse Owens wore when he humiliated the Third Reich on home soil. This was the most visible rebuke to Nazi racial ideology at the time and lives on in history as like the biggest fuck you to the Nazis. But those shoes were designed by the Nazis? Question mark? So Jesse Owens would later say that Rudi Dassler was one of the most important people in his athletic career. The man who gave him the shoes, however, never seemed to publicly reckon with the contradiction. But it didn't matter. Sales exploded to 200,000 pairs a year in the years following the 1936 Olympic. The company was the most successful sporting goods manufacturer in all of Germany. And then the war started. When the war kicked off, the Dassler factory was converted to producing the Panzerschreck, the Tank Terror, an anti-tank rocket launcher. This was a far cry from the sneakers they had made a few years earlier, and at least 9 forced laborers worked for the company during this period. The brothers' relationship was already under a fair amount of strain because their families were forced to live together in the same villa. Adi's wife was a teenager when they married, and Rudi's wife absolutely despised her. And if you've ever been on a family holiday, you would know that the wives' conflict very quickly became the brothers' conflict. Passive aggression became open fighting quite quickly. So Rudi was drafted into the German army while Adi was given a deferment. He was needed to run the factory. Rudi always believed that his brother had engineered his conscription deliberately, that Adi had pulled some strings to send him to the front line while he got to stay safe at home. And then came the moment that, depending on who you believe, either started the feud or at least confirmed it. So we're in the middle of the war and the Allies are bombing. Adi and his wife climb into a bomb shelter that is already occupied by Rudi and his wife. As he ducks in, Adi says the dirty bastards are back again. Allegedly, he was referring to the Allied aircraft, but Rudi was convinced that the remark was directed at him and his family. That's all it took. Whether it was said in a panic about enemy aircraft or in contempt towards his brother, nobody really knows. But what matters is that Rudi chose to believe the latter, and from that moment on, the partnership was over in everything but the name. So when Rudi eventually returned from the war front, both brothers had to go through the whole denazification process required by the Allies. They would end up testifying against each other at the hearings. Now, I don't care how much you hate your siblings, how much you fight with them, testifying against them at a denazification hearing is like next level. These are brothers testifying against each other in not only a court of law, but a court of law about denazification after World War II. What? And so the Dassler Brothers Shoe Company was kaput. So in January 1948, Rudi would register his company as Schaffabrik Rudolf Dassler, Ruda for short. And within the year, he would eventually change this name to Puma. And then in August of 1949, Adi would start Adidas, a contraction of his nickname Adi and the first 3 letters of Dassler. The workforce was split between them, with Adidas keeping the factory by the train station and 2/3 of the employees. This was great for those employees because most of them actually preferred Adi's emphasis on product development over Rudi's sales-oriented approach. In exchange, Rudi got to keep the factory on Wurschberger Street and the remaining third of the employees. These two factories were built on opposite sides of the River Aurach, which ran through Herzogenaurach. This river divided the town quite literally. Adidas to the north, Puma to the south. So the interesting thing here is that the entire town got caught up in this feud. This feels like how people entertained themselves before reality TV was a thing. Respectfully, why is everybody else in this town more worried about two brothers fighting than anything else going on in the world after World War II? I fear there might be bigger fish to fry. But apparently there wasn't, because this rivalry reached absurd proportions. There were bakeries that would only serve Adidas workers, bars that only Puma workers could drink at. Dating or marrying across company lines was strongly discouraged. This was shoemaker segregation. Even schools were split across brand lines. And ultimately, Herzogenaurach became known as the town of bent necks, because people looked down at your shoes before deciding whether or not to talk to you. So this was a town of 3,500 people where you couldn't buy bread from the wrong bakery because of which shoes you wore. All because two brothers couldn't share a bomb shelter without one of them potentially misreading a sentence. And now we are in West Germany. It's the 1954 World Cup. I know I've already covered Adi's role in the West German team in my previous episode about the Miracle of Bern, but here is the commercial context. So obviously the World Cup was the biggest deal in the world for Adidas, but the added context here is that the West German team's manager, Sepp Herberger, actually had a rift with Rudi, which meant that Puma couldn't sponsor the national team. Adidas got the contract instead. This meant that the final was Adidas against Puma, not just metaphorically, but also literally, with some Hungarian players wearing Puma boots. This just adds a whole nother element to the Miracle of Bern. Obviously, you've got two countries battling it out, but on a more macro level, you have two brothers who haven't spoken in 6 years, watching their boots on the same pitch at the Wankdorf Stadium. It is bucketing down with rain, and I'm sure for Rudi at least, he suddenly didn't care that much if West Germany won the World Cup. He wanted Puma to win. And for these two brothers, this wasn't a matter of national pride. This wasn't about West Germany. This would either be a victory for Adidas or a victory for Puma. So Adi's development of football boots with interchangeable screw-in studs and West Germany's subsequent victory wearing said boots would propel Adidas into a global powerhouse. Since the rift prevented Puma from sponsoring West Germany, Adidas received all of the positive international coverage and was able to get a hold of the international shoe market, growing bigger and faster than Puma and all of their competition. And that's kind of all it took. It was one game of football on a particularly muddy pitch and Adi's idea of screw-in studs that would absolutely catapult Adidas to global fame. Puma, on the other hand, was left chasing. And for the next 16 years, Rudi chased like his life depended on it. By 1970, both companies had grown enormously. Adidas was in the lead, but Puma was not far behind. They had both signed deals with major athletes, Adidas having Muhammad Ali and Puma having the Brazil national team. So the most famous athlete in the world at the time was Pelé. And prior to the 1970 tournament, the brothers had agreed on the Pelé Pact. Neither company would sponsor Pelé directly because the bidding war would become way too expensive. And then Puma basically said, bet. A Puma representative named Hans Henningsen approached Pelé and offered $120,000, over $1 million in today's money, for him to wear the Puma Kings. The contract had one specific clause in it. Pelé had to ask the referee for a moment before kickoff. In the quarterfinal between Brazil and Peru, at the opening of the match, Pelé walked into the center circle and intentionally requested that the referee stopped the clock so he could tie his boots. The cameras pulled into focus and the whole world stared at a pair of Puma Kings. Puma would ultimately enjoy a 300% increase in sales after the tournament. And as you'd expect, Adidas was pissed. This wasn't the first time that Puma had undercut them, and it was an extension of the Dassler brothers' feud. Rudi had been chasing Adi since 1948. Credit where credit is due to Rudi, this man chased for 22 years, through World Cup finals and Olympic Games and denazification hearings. And in Mexico in 1970, with the world watching in color for the very first time, he finally landed the biggest blow. And the irony of all this is that he didn't get to actually enjoy it for very long. Rudi would ultimately die in 1974, with Adi dying 4 years later in 1978. They would ultimately be buried at opposite sides of the cemetery as far as their graves could possibly be. They never reconciled. They never spoke again. Rudolph's grandson Michael told the BBC, "We didn't even mention the name Adidas at home. It's like Harry Potter, the name Voldemort, which is just not mentioned." The sad part about this is that neither brother lived long enough to see what would become of their rival brands that are now so synonymous with sport. Instead, they let their feud tear their family apart, which I think is really sad. So after both brothers died in the 70s, the division gradually waned, with the two biggest football clubs in the area being sponsored by Puma and Adidas respectively. It wouldn't be until 2009, 61 years after the split, that employees of both companies symbolized the end of the feud by playing a friendly football match. That's how it all ended. A football match between the employees of the two companies in the town of Bent Necks. 61 years after, two brothers could not possibly share a bomb shelter together. Nowadays, neither company is controlled by Dassler descendants. Adidas is the second largest sportswear company in the world, and Puma is third. Both companies fall behind Nike, a company that neither brother saw coming. While Adidas and Puma were too busy watching each other, Nike succeeded. And perhaps if they had stayed together and combined their strengths, Phil Knight would not have been able to come through and swoop in underneath them and beat them both. But more on him in another episode. And that's the story of the greatest own goal in business history, scored in a bomb shelter in 1943.